recognize Mr. Shiff for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of follow-up questions before I pass to Representative Sewell. It wasn't simply that the Russians had a negative preference against Secretary Clinton. They also had a positive preference for Donald Trump. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
And I want to ask you to say whether this is an accurate characterization of Mr. Trump. I won't put you in that spot. But would it be logical for the Kremlin to prefer a candidate that disparaged NATO to be President of the United States?
You're not going to put me in that spot, you said?
Yes.
I'm happy with that. I'm happy with that.
I'm not going to put you in the spot of answering whether this is an accurate characterization of Mr. Trump's views, but it would be logical for the Kremlin to want someone who had a dim view of NATO. Is that right?
All kidding aside, I don't think that's something I should be answering. That's beyond my responsibilities.
Well, what is the Russian view of NATO? Do they like NATO? Do they want to see NATO strong?
Well, again, I'm sure you have already spoken to people who are greater experts than I, but yeah, they don't like NATO. They think NATO encircles them and threatens them.
And would they have a preference for a candidate that expressed an openness to repealing the sanctions over Ukraine?
And I don't want to get into business of commenting on that. I know.
Well, then let me ask you this way, Director. Would they like to see the sanctions on Ukraine go away?
Yes.
Would they have a preference for a candidate who expressed open admiration for Putin?
And I hope you'll reformulate the question. Mr. Putin would like people who like him.
Would they have a preference for a candidate who encouraged Brexit and other departures from Europe? Would they like to see more Brexits?
Yes.
And have the Russians in Europe demonstrated a preference for business people as political leaders with the hope that they can entangle them in financial interests, or that they may allow their financial interests to take precedence over the interests of the countries in Europe they represent?
In our joint report, we recount that the Russians, that President Putin has expressed a preference for business leaders in leading other governments, and mentions Gerhard Schroeder and I'm going to forget one. Berlusconi, because he believes they're people that are more open to negotiation, easier to deal with.
At this point, let me yield to Representative Sewell.
I'd like to continue my questioning, the line of questioning on Michael Flynn. I'm sure you can understand my concern that Mr. Flynn not only failed to disclose the contacts with the Russian ambassador, but he said he did not remember whether he discussed sanctions against Russia with that ambassador. And I find that really hard to believe. And wouldn't you think that at the height of our concern about Russian hacking, that Mr. Flynn would have remembered meeting with the Russian ambassador and would have told him to stop meddling in our affairs? But that didn't happen, did it?
So that's not something I can answer.
Not only did Mr. Flynn not remember talking to the Russian ambassador, and not only did he not remember what they talked about it. Now, Mr. Comey, do you think that Mr. Flynn's failure to disclose the communication and contact he had with the Russian ambassador and their topic of conversation, along with a blatant lie to Vice President Pence, meet the standard for an investigation by the FBI?
I have to give you the same answer. I'm not going to comment.
Now, I know, Director Comey, that you probably can't comment on this as well, but I think it's really important that we review a short timeline and that's based on press reportings because we need to get this for the public record, I think. So on December 25th, 2016, Mr. Flynn reportedly exchanged text messages with the Russian ambassador. On December 28th, 2016, Mr. Flynn reportedly spoke on the phone with the Russian ambassador. By then, it was pretty clear that the Obama administration was going to take actions against Russia. On December 29th, 2016, Mr. Flynn reportedly spoke on the phone with the Russian ambassador again. That day, the Obama administration expelled 35 Russian operatives from the United States and announced new sanctions. We also know from press reportings that sometime in December, Mr. Flynn met in person with the Russian ambassador at Trump Tower, and that Mr. Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was also there. The purpose of the meeting was to, quote, establish a line of communication, end quote, with the Kremlin. I should add that the White House and Mr. Flynn didn't disclose this December face-to-face meeting until this month. On January 12th, 2017, press reported that Mr. Flynn contacted the Russian ambassador again. And on January 15th, 2015, Vice President-elect Mike Pence stated on several Sunday morning shows regarding Mr. Flynn's conversation with the ambassador, quote, "What I can confirm, having spoken to him about it, is that those conversations that happened to occur around the time that the United States took action to expel diplomats had nothing whatsoever to do with those sanctions," end quote. On January 26th, the acting Attorney General Sally Yates reportedly told President Trump's White House counsel, who immediately told President Trump, that Mr. Flynn was vulnerable to Russian blackmail because of discrepancies between Vice President-elect Pence's public statement and Mr. Flynn's actual discussions. On February 10th, President Trump denied knowledge of this, telling reporters on Air Force One, quote, "I don't know about that," end quote, in response to questions about Mr. Flynn's conduct. The White House also publicly denied that Mr. Flynn and the Russian ambassador discussed sanctions. And of course, on February 13th, 2017, Mr. Flynn resigned as National Security Advisor. Now, Director Comey, all of these, given Russia's longstanding desire to cultivate relations with influential U.S. persons, isn't the American public right to be concerned about Mr. Flynn's conduct, his failure to disclose that contact with the Russian ambassador, his attempts to cover it up, and what looks like the White House's attempts to sweep this under the rug? Don't we as the American people deserve the right to know? And shouldn't our FBI investigate such claims?
I can't comment. I understand people's curiosity about our work and intense interest in it, and as Mr. King said, oftentimes speculation about it, but we can't do it well or fairly to the people we investigate if we talk about it, so I can't comment.
I'd like to turn to another topic about Mr. Flynn. His failure to disclose until pressured last week by my colleagues on the House Oversight and Government Relations Committee, Government Reforms Committee, payments he received from Russia for his 2015 trip to the 10th anniversary gala of RT, the Russian-owned propaganda media outlet. According to the January 2017 declassified IC assessment report, RT's criticism of the United States was, quote, "the last facet of its broader and longstanding anti-U.S. messaging likely aimed at undermining viewers' trust in the U.S. democratic procedures," end quote. This January assessment points out that this was a strategy that Russia employed going back to before the 2012 elections, according to the IC assessment. So, Admiral Rogers, am I right that the RT is essentially owned by the Russian government? And how long has the intelligence community been looking at RT as an arm of the Russian government?
So we're certainly aware and have been for some period of time of the direct connections between the Russian government and RT individuals. We're aware of monetary flow and other things.
And how long have you known about that? A few months, a few years? I mean, how long has the United States?
Some number of years. I apologize, ma'am. I just don't know off the top of my head.
Aren't I right to assume then that the former director of DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, Mr. Flynn, would have been aware that RT's role as an anti-U.S. Russian propaganda outlet when he agreed to speak at their anniversary gala in 2015? Isn't it reasonable to assume that he would know?
I'm not in a position to comment on the knowledge of something else from another person, ma'am.
Director Comey, would it be unusual for a foreign government official to get paid by a foreign adversary to attend such an event? And would it be unusual and raise some questions at the FBI if that person failed to disclose the payments received for that trip?
I don't know in general, and as to the specific, I'm just not going to comment.
Yes, sir. I understand that you can't comment, but I'd like to read an exchange between Mr. Flynn and a Yahoo News correspondent from July 2016 regarding the event. The correspondent asks, "Were you paid for that event?" Then there was back and forth for a bit, and then Mr. Flynn said, quote, "Yeah, I didn't take any money from Russia, if that's what you're asking me," end quote. So Director Comey, isn't it true that the House Oversight Committee last week received information and released publicly that Mr. Flynn accepted nearly $35,000 in speaking fees and traveling fees from RT, this Russian government-owned media outlet?
I believe I've seen news accounts to that effect.
Moreover, isn't it also true that according to the Emoluments Clause of the United States Constitution, a person holding any office of profit or trust cannot accept gifts or payments from a foreign country? And doesn't the DoD, the Department of Defense, prohibit retired military officers from taking any consulting fees, gifts, traveling expenses, honorariums, or salary from a foreign government, including commercial enterprises owned by or controlled by a foreign government, like RT?
It's not something I can comment on.
Can you speak to whether or not the Emoluments Clause would apply to someone like Mr. Flynn, a retired three-star general?
I can't.
So isn't it, I just find it to be really hard to believe that given the Emoluments Clause does apply to retired officers like Mr. Flynn, I can't believe that Mr. Flynn, a retired military officer, would take money from the Russian government in violation of the United States Constitution. And I believe that such violations worthy of a criminal investigation by the FBI. What level of proof do we need in order for us to have a criminal investigation by the FBI of Mr. Flynn?
I can't comment on that.
Shouldn't the American people be concerned? I think that it's really hard for us to fathom that he wouldn't know that he should have disclosed that he received $35,000 as a part of a speaking engagement to RT, the Russian U.S. anti-propaganda outlet.
I can't comment on that, Ms. Sewell.
My final line of questioning is in regard to Mr. Flynn working as an agent of a foreign power. Now, Director Comey, following on Mr. Himes's line of questioning, am I correct that the Foreign Agents Registration Act requires that individuals who lobby on behalf of a foreign government must register with the United States government?
I believe that's correct. I know I keep saying I'm not an expert. The reason I'm saying that is I don't know exactly how they define things like lobbying in the statute, but as a general matter, if you're going to represent a foreign government here in the United States touching our government, you should be registered.
And isn't it true that just last November 2016, Mr. Flynn was working as a foreign agent doing work that principally benefited the government of Turkey, and yet he didn't report it until just last week?
I can't comment on that.
Isn't it true that Mr. Flynn was reportedly paid over $500,000 for this work?
Same answer.
And isn't it true that the Trump White House, on at least 2 occasions, was asked by Mr. Flynn's lawyers whether he should report that work, the work that he was doing on behalf of the Turkish government, and yet the administration didn't give him any advice to the contrary? Do you know anything about that?
I have to give you the same answer.
Investigations are ongoing with U.S. persons, and I respect that. I think it's important, though, that the American people understand the scope and breadth of what, in public, open source press reportings of Mr. Flynn's actions that led to his resignation. And while we can't talk about whether there are an investigation, I believe that we here at HPSI, at the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, must put those facts into the public domain. And they are, 1, that Mr. Flynn lied about his communication with the Russian ambassador. Secondly, that Mr. Flynn lied about taking money from the Russian government. And thirdly, that Mr. Flynn, at a minimum, did not disclose work as an agent of a foreign power, and that the White House did not help in this concern. So, gentlemen, it's clear to me that Mr. Flynn should be under criminal investigation, and I know you cannot comment. But I believe it is my duty as a member of this committee to comment to the American people that his engagement of lying and failure to disclose really important information and contacts with a foreign ambassador do rise to the level of disclosure and, to me, criminal intent. So I say this to say that the American people deserve to know the full extent of Mr. Flynn's involvement with the Russians and the extent to which it influenced the 2016 election. I believe our democracy requires it. Thank you. I yield back to my ranking member.
Time's expired.